Hi, I'm Katie Miranda, and welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit. Today I'm here with Ramah Kudaimi, Director of Grassroots Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Welcome, Ramah.
Thank you so much, Katie, for having me.
So you guys just finished a conference, a nationwide conference called the Together We Rise Conference. How did that go? Tell us about that.
Yes, so the conference just happened this past weekend under the theme of Together We Rise, the struggle for collective justice from the U.S. to Palestine. It was really a phenomenal experience, and I'm not saying that as a biased person, obviously, but people kept coming to us and letting us know how wonderful it was to be in this gathering. We had over 500 people, which is our biggest conference yet. We've had conferences since 2001. So to see the movement grow so much in the last 17 years was very inspiring. We had a mix of plenary sessions as well as workshops. The workshops were on topics ranging from accountability to Palestinians, to Palestinian indigenous solidarity, to talking about how we do facilitation in ways that actually empowers marginalized communities in our movement, to talking about Palestine 101 and BDS 101, understanding that there are new people coming to the movement and we can't forget about needing to come back to the basics at times. And then the plenaries were phenomenal. Reverend William Barber opened up the night from the 2018 Peeler People's campaigns, and it was really inspiring. And then we had the opportunity to honor Representative Congressman Betty McCollum on our Saturday night event for her important work in support of Palestinian children's human rights.
Wonderful. So you were telling me earlier that the U.S. campaign is trying to push Palestine into the progressive agenda. What does that mean? Does that mean you're talking to people in the Democratic Party, or how is that working?
So since Trump came to power now for almost, it's been a year and a half, plus a long year and a half, what we've been witnessing is a rejuvenation of so many movements for social justice. And it's a really exciting time to be an activist, to be an organizer, to be anyone who's really concerned with social justice. And while none of these systems of oppression that people are fighting against are new or taking or tackling are new, it is really, again, inspiring to see how many people are essentially new activists or longtime organizers sitting down and rethinking, okay, how do we need to redo the way we do our organizing in this particular moment? And so as various people come together, people who are concerned with freedom and justice, and they're coming together to declare their opposition to Trump's agenda, his agenda that is full of racism and oppression, it's very important for us who are concerned with Palestinian rights to make sure that is part of that agenda. And that is why we're talking about making sure Palestine is part of the progressive agenda in this country. We're seeing elected officials, we're seeing major organizations say that, no, we are going to position ourselves as the resistance to Trump's policies. And we, again, need to make sure that that includes Palestine, that we can no longer have this progressive except for Palestine stance, that Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality needs to be part of this progressive agenda. And so one example of how we're trying to do this is earlier this summer, we went to Netroots Nation, which is one of the largest gatherings of progressives in this country. And we had a panel there, called Progressives for Palestinian Rights, which featured national and local leaders who identify themselves as progressives, talking about how they're pursuing Palestinian rights in their work. So for example, we had council member Cheryl Devia, who's a part of the Berkeley California Council. And she, in 2015, was actually kicked off of this Human Rights Commission because she brought forth a resolution talking about the need to divest Berkeley from corporations that are profiting off of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. And she was kicked off. And usually the story just ends there. Someone gets kicked off, and then we never hear of them. But no, she decided to fight back, and human rights supporters all across the country supported her. So she was forced herself back onto the commission, and then eventually actually ran for council and made it on. And so again, a lot of times we talk about backlash, but what we need to do is talk about this backlash openly and make people understand that why is it that we can be pursuing boycott and divestment tactics, for example, against fossil fuel companies, or boycott and divestment tactics against private prisons. But then when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden this is off the table, and we're told that this is actually wrong and it's not in support of human rights. So continuing to push related to the progressive agenda opens up people's minds, because they're going to start thinking, wait a minute, why am I supposed to be for human rights for all these peoples except for Palestine? Why is it that the progressive politicians who are talking to me as, a black activist, as a young activist, as a progressive Democrat, they don't want me to talk about Palestinian rights when everyone around me is actually concerned with Palestinian rights?
How are you trying to push this into the Democratic Party, or are you doing that? Like kind of
I
mainstream
think we're
Democrats.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing a partisan divide. We're seeing more and more, and Trump gives us this opportunity of, like, the people who are lining up against Trump's policies are pro-Republicans, um, and who is fighting against them is Democrats. That does not mean that means all the Democrats are on point with Palestine, and that's why we need to keep pushing.
Hmm.
But for example, Representative Betty McCollum, her bill around the human rights of Palestinian children that was introduced last November, at this point has 30 co-sponsors, which is a huge deal. It doesn't seem like much in terms of, we have 400 plus representative and we're like 30, but that's a huge deal, and it's really it gives us so many opportunities. And when Betty McCollum, who frankly, is a mainstream Democratic Party member, comes to our conference and calls out Israel for pursuing apartheid policies, and is there making the right wing comparisons between how both the U.S. and Israel are pursuing right wing policies. That is important, and that's why we think continuing to push and make people understand, like, you can't position yourself as anti right wing, as anti-Trump, as anti-white supremacy, and pro-justice, for freedom, for equality, and then be on the side of Trump when it comes to Palestinian rights.
What about framing the issue? I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I don't feel like Palestine should really be like a left or a right issue. I see it as a human rights issue, and it's been pushed like way over to the left. So if you're a leftist, you should be supporting Palestine, and if you're on the right, you shouldn't. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm just wondering if there's anything going on with like more conservative Congress people, trying to get them to see, like, this is a human rights issue, and it's like a national security issue kind of too, and a national interest issue. Is there anything like that going on that you know of?
I know there is. I think our position is what we're witnessing now, especially again with the ascendance of Trump, with the ascendance of right wing movements, not only in the United States, but across the globe, and the full on support, unfortunately, by a lot of people who would identify themselves as Republicans and or conservative, that they actually are not necessarily concerned with human rights. And I think that's very important for us who are talking about issues of Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality, that these systems of oppression are interlinked, are interconnected, and we need to pursue our work for Palestinian rights within that framework that doesn't conflate struggles, that doesn't pretend it's all the same, but understands that we need to be coming together, and who our potential co-conspirators are in this struggle, who our potential allies are in the struggle, are the people who are actually suffering from these same types of oppression. So when we're talking about, quote unquote, U.S. national security, well, U.S. national security is built on Islamophobia, is built on anti-blackness, is built on imperialism, and this idea that somehow or another that we can pursue Palestinian rights within that framework is just, frankly, I think, wrong, because it's built on the idea of dehumanizing a lot of human beings that happen to share a lot of the similarities of Palestinians, i.e., being Muslim, i.e., being brown, i.e., being Arab, and we cannot separate that from the greater struggles in the region and then the greater struggles of all across. I think it's very important that we need to understand that what the U.S., Israel, as well as other governments are pursuing the same sort of agendas, those being right-wing agendas, those being agendas of imperialism, those being agendas that are very much against people's struggles for freedom, justice, and equality, no matter where they are. And so our power is in the people. And that doesn't mean that we don't do advocacy work, because advocacy work is very much an important part of that. In the end of the day, Congress does have the ability to, for example, cut military aid to Israel, which is an important part of the work we're pursuing. But they don't, we have the power, we as people, and we can make those demands in ways that ensure that we are actually strengthening all movements for social justice.
So, could you tell me, in your opinion, what resistance tactics or what organizational tactics are working on the ground in Palestine in general, if you're involved in that? Like, what's actually producing positive results?
Yeah. Well, I think, as people who are in solidarity with Palestine, with Palestinians, the fact that just simply Palestinians existing on their land is very much, the resisting tactics that is ensured that Israel cannot accomplish its goals of completely, pushing Palestinians off their land. It's ethnic cleansing goals. And what we're seeing now since March, the ongoing Great Return March, as Palestinian refugees in Gaza are marching to, attempting to reach the villages that they were pushed and displaced from 70 plus years. It's a very important reminder that the core of the struggle is the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the millions of Palestinian refugees that are scattered across the region and in the diaspora. And Israel's crackdown on the marchers, they've killed, I believe, now close to 200, injured thousands of more, brought so many condemnations from people across the globe, from influencers across the globe, the celebrities, the members of Congress, the journalists who had in the past not spoken out about this. So again, they're connecting like, oh, I understand what I'm going through, oppressive policies that Trump's putting me through. It makes you start understanding and feeling and hearing what others are going through also. And the marchers have inspired so many other struggles for freedom and justice and equality. So we saw how, for example, the movement for Black Lives put out a statement in solidarity with the Palestinian protesters in Gaza. We saw notes of solidarity being exchanged between Palestinian protesters in Gaza and, for example, Syrian protesters in Idlib, both making demands that people need to understand that their calls for wanting to live with human rights and dignity need to be heard by people. And so our work outside of Palestine needs to continue because it creates more of that space for people on the ground, for this, like examples like this, like the Great Return March, to actually flourish and succeed in putting an end to Israel's continued occupation and ethnic cleansing.
So, what tactics are coming from the international community? What's actually producing results in people, like everyday people? What should people keep doing?
Yeah. So BDS campaigns, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, continue to be such a big part of resisting Israel's denial of Palestinian rights. And I think, the beauty of BDS is that regular, everyday people can exert their power. Again, we tend to think like, oh, the people who have the power are the politicians, elected officials. No, we have power. We have power as consumers. We have power as investors. We have power as just people of conscience to continue to push the discourse, to let people understand what is happening in Palestine, and then to tell them, hey, you actually are complicit in this way and that way, and this is how you can change that complicity. And so just in the last year, I was looking up like a list of examples of what we were able to accomplish in just the last year. And this is globally. This is not only in the United States, globally. And that's, again, the beauty of BDS, is that it connects activism across borders. So we saw big name artists like Lorde and Lana Del Rey cancel their concerts in Israel. Adidas, which is a sports company, ended its sponsorships of soccer teams in Israeli settlements. Argentina, the national soccer team, canceled its World Cup friendly with the Israeli national team. Church bodies and student and universities keep passing resolutions to divest from corporations and companies profiting off of Israel's human rights abuses. And so we need to continue to pursue BDS campaigns. It is very important, even in the face of so much backlash, because we should see that backlash as evidence that what we are doing is working. People who are pursuing BDS, trying to criminalize BDS, pro-Israel groups, they're very open. Like, we don't want to debate about BDS. We just want to shut it down because they understand they're going to lose the debate. And it's been a tactic of the opposition for years and years and years that they just want to shut down debate. They want to shut down Students for Justice in Palestine groups. They want to make people scared of pursuing BDS because they know they will, if you actually talk to a person and tell them this is what's happening in Palestine, this is what Israel's doing, this is what our tax dollars are doing, that people will be like, no, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing this? And what we're seeing also now, and these tactics of BDS, boycott and divestment, are not new. They're historically proven to be successful. When Palestinian civil society put out the call in 2005, they echoed the fact that these are tactics that were used by the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And what we're seeing now, again, we talked about all this rejuvenation of movements. They're using these tactics too. So again, we're talking about people who are talking about we need to divest from private prisons. We need to divest from fossil fuels. People are talking about boycotting Trump. Like when artists were refusing to sing at his inauguration, we're going to boycott Trump. Well, that's cultural boycott. That's what.
Yeah.
And so it's also an opportunity for Palestinian rights activists to kind of share lessons learned now that the BDS call has been and the movement has been happening for 13 plus years. I think another really important thing we need to continue doing is building across these movements. So we have a curriculum on our website at uscpr.org/Together We Rise that includes, again, 101s about Palestine, because we understood that people are actually now just hearing about Palestine. They need, okay, what does this even mean? What are we talking about refugees? What is Gaza, etc.? So it has a lot of that, but also resources talking about the connections between the forces of oppression impacting Black, Brown, Indigenous communities globally to understand why we need to have this intersectional lens when we're talking about how to fight back. So, for example, we did this one webinar that was based upon the premise of if you are against Trump's Muslim ban, you need to be against Israel's banning of Palestinian refugees from returning to their homeland, and vice versa. So, I think there's power in that too, in terms of, again, situating Palestine within all these other struggles, based both, morally, that's what we should be doing, and on principles, but also we know the corporations that are, for example, that built Israel's various walls and surveillance towers are the same ones bidding to build Trump's, wall.
Right.
We know things like G4S, which is the private prison company that helped, that for so long was helping Israel run its private prisons where Palestinian political prisoners were held, oftentimes without charge, oftentimes tortured, and even killed. That G4S was doing security at Standing Rock. So these corporations are making the connections. Governments are exchanging lessons learned. So we have Jewish Voice for Peace, their Deadly Exchange campaign, which is about ending police exchanges, ending the fact that the U.S. police go and train and learn from Israel, and then they come back and pursue these tactics. Not because the United States is like, needs to learn from Israel. Obviously, the U.S. existed long before Israel. It's a settler colonial state, just like Israel. It was built on the enslavement of African people. It was built on the genocide of indigenous populations. So they don't need to learn things, but what their understanding is, it's better that we share these best practices of how we oppress people. And so we need to then come together and say, okay, then we should also be working together. Not that our struggles are all the same, not that there aren't very important differences we need to be aware from, but that's how our collective power can be brought together.
So I'm thinking, when you were talking about the BDS successes, I'm thinking about how when Roger Waters kind of had his awakening on Palestine and he became such an advocate of BDS and Palestinian rights. And I'm wondering if any of these artists who have been canceling, is there outreach going out to them and saying, hey, come, don't just boycott, come help us, join us, like Roger Waters did. Is there anything like that going on?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are people doing that work, and it takes time. I think we see what we see when people do step up and say we are going to be supportive of we just assume, oh well, they just got it overnight and that was the end of it. But no, that takes a lot of power and a lot of organizing. And so yes, it is definitely part of understanding why it was exciting seeing, in the midst of the death that and the injuries that was happening with the Great Return March, acknowledging that, but at the same time understanding that the reason they are doing that is to bring attention to their cause, to bring attention specifically to the cause of refugees. And people were pursuing that. People were, we saw groups like United We Dream, who, is talking about immigrant rights, put out a statement that this is wrong. We saw, Ava DuVernay or Sean King, again, people who have a lot of followers as journalists, as filmmakers, put out statements saying this is wrong. And that's the first step. And the idea is, ideally, yes, we would continue to build relationships with these influencers, not because influencers are somehow more important than the rest of people, but because we understand that they also have so many millions of followers that will be there. And it gives us
They're
opportunities to
influencers.
talk about their influence, exactly.
Yeah,
And
they
it
influence
gives us
people.
opportunity to talk about this issue in ways that is, a lot of times people get, the news is not necessarily always inspiring, but what does it look like to then have this? So I'll bring one example of a campaign we worked on. So when the NFL delegation that was canceled back in 2017, there was about a dozen or so NFL players that were planning to go, that Israel invited to come on a delegation, and Israel was very clearly like, we're using you in order to come back and talk about how great Israel is and how great your trip is, and you're going to impact all your fans. Well, so when Michael Bennett made the decision to pull out, and that set the stage for so many other of the delegation to also skip the trip and decide, no, we're not going to let our Israel use our celebrity that way. I mean, we had stories about Palestine and the occupation and checkpoints, etc., and sports arenas, sports outlets like ESPN.
Right.
And that's important too, because people are going to want to relate to Palestine in what is most meaningful to them. And we have to figure out multiple ways to get people to understand what's happening to the Palestinian people and how it actually is connected to what they're going through as well.
Can you tell us, in your opinion, what tactics are not working from the international community or in Palestine and people should stop doing?
So one thing I think we need to take seriously is how we need to kind of what we call de-exceptionalizing Palestine. And it's something that a lot of groups do. I know when we're talking about how we do our solidarity work with the Palestinian struggle, we have to acknowledge that, unfortunately, the reality is that their struggle is one of many struggles, both current and past, of people pursuing freedom, justice, and equality. And it's important that we then, like we were talking about earlier, situate our work within a framework that acknowledges that, not to erase the important differences between struggles, not to compare struggles, but to strengthen our collective commitment to liberation and equality. So Rev Barber, who opened up our conference this past weekend, he spoke at our conference about and pointed out how when we all come together, we outnumber and outpower those seeking to entrench the status quo. And the status quo is oppression. That's what it is. Just acknowledge that. And it's also important, to understand that our opposition, pro-Israel's groups, are constantly exceptionalizing Palestine. They are the ones telling us that actually Palestinians, unlike everyone else, don't deserve human rights. They're the ones telling us that actually, yes, using boycott and divestment around fossil fuels or private prisons or pipelines is very important and noble, but when it comes to Palestinian rights, it's wrong and it's a problem and we shouldn't do it. So the way to respond is to say, no, then we're going to de-exceptionalize Palestine. Palestine is not different in terms of their rights to pursue the struggle, their rights to pursue dignity, their right to pursue freedom, justice, and equality. And when we understand that, we're able to strengthen our work, not only in support of the Palestinian people, but also against all struggles against oppression. And again, it goes back to the idea of that these systems are interconnected. The corporations are profiting from all these systems. The governments and regimes are sharing best practices in terms of how to oppress people. And we can't fight in isolation, because it's hard. When you're fighting in isolation, you think you're the only one. But when you put your struggle amongst so many other struggles, and you're like, oh, wait, we are not alone. Palestinians are not alone. They are interconnected to all these struggles across borders and across time. I think another thing is interesting is just this, we just marked in September, 25 years since Oslo. And I think most people who are concerned with Palestinian rights know there was never actually any real attempt at a peace process.
Right.
And
It's a
but the
smokescreen.
Yeah, it's a smokescreen. But the fact that, and the fact that the situation since 1993 has deteriorated so much for Palestinians is just further proof of why we need to continue to build up our grassroots power. So that when we are pursuing advocacy, it's actually helping the Palestinian people in their struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And I think that's kind of again, I think no one is surprised that Oslo didn't actually bring any of this. But for people who are still concerned, who are still talking about peace process and negotiations,
Yeah.
um, I think, and especially now for people who are just kind of getting it, and it's interesting how we balance of the people who are like, oh my God, Trump is the one who actually ruined everything because he moved the embassy and he's cutting aid to Palestinian refugees. And it's like, okay, yeah, he's
No.
definitely, he's putting another nail in the coffin. But it's not like this was ever going to actually succeed in bringing
Yeah.
about justice for Palestinians. But how do we then step in and be like, listen, this is what's working. BDS is what's working. Palestinians continuing to resist on the ground is what's working. That is what is really putting our opposition, is really scaring them, freaking them out. That's why they want to criminalize BDS. That's why Israel's reacting um, with so much propaganda around what's happening in Gaza, like, oh, the terror kites and all this nonsense. It's just like anyone with any sort of conscience would be like, what are you talking about? People are flying kites and you're shooting at them and then you want us to sympathize with you? That doesn't make any sense. And so again, we're in this opportunity of how we use people awakening because of Trump to be like, okay, I'm glad you're finally being able to getting it. Come and understand that this is part and parcel of what these systems of oppression have always wanted to do.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that everybody has their own awakening on their own time, and I think we should really welcome all these new people into the movement. I know sometimes people are criticized for, not having known earlier or needing to be educated or whatever, but I keep when I think about all the different organizations and coalitions that we need to work together for this issue, I think about how Nelson Mandela, like, he would work with anybody who supported his struggle. And that's one of the things that I think our movement really needs to remember. We may have our own differences, we may have differences of opinion over certain issues, but to be able to come together and work on this, I feel is really important. You had mentioned earlier to me about cities for Palestine. What's that? Is that like sister city
Yeah.
campaigns? Is the
Yeah.
U.S.
So
campaign working on that?
yeah, for sure. So folks can check out our website, citiesforpalestine.org, which we launched earlier this year. And really, it's an opportunity to continue to build on the amazing work that both ourselves and partner organizations like Friends of Sabine North America, and then the so many local organizers who pursued municipal campaigns locally in order to push for Palestinian rights. And I think in this moment in time where we're seeing, so much activism happening on the city level. So people are asking their council members to, protect immigrants and refugees. People are asking their city council members to, again, divest from fossil fuels and banks who are, providing the funding for the pipelines. That we want to make sure that Palestine, again, is part of that agenda, that progressive agenda, not only on a congressional level, but in the local level. And I think it's exciting because we've seen already this work is already happening. So we've seen, success in Portland. We've seen success in St. Louis. We've seen success in Sacramento, in Durham. Durham, just a couple months ago, it was the first ever city that decided to end all police exchanges with Israel, which is,
Oh, wow.
that sets the
Great.
stage.
Hmm.
So our power is, I think, part of, we're pursuing a lot of campaigns. Part of our power is at the city level where you have the grassroots, and the grassroots is so directly in touch with their city council members. And these city council members are elected officials. So we're doing policy work. and hopefully that reverberates across the state and then leads to nationally, where Congress is finally being able to actually pursue the policies that we want them to pursue in support of Palestinian rights. And we should think about these city council members are eventually going to run for Congress one day. So how are we kind of getting them? And so we have a whole array of ideas on the Cities for Palestine website of how people could pursue municipal campaigns. Sister Cities is one example of that. Another is the Deadly Exchange that JVP does. Another is convincing city council members to skip the trip, i.e. not go on propaganda trips when Israel and pro-Israel groups offer them. And a lot of the resources are around the framework of invest, divest, the work that we've been doing. So getting people like, no, you need to cut contracts with the corporations that are complicit. You need to divest from Israel and instead use that money to invest in our communities here at home when we're talking about military aid to Israel. So yes, cities can put out resolutions condemning this. Why are we sending this money to Israel for weapons that are used to kill Palestinian children when children in our communities don't have funding for proper schools or healthcare? So I think there's, again, the idea is being that you as a person have power, and that power can be most wielded locally. And so while we pursue the important work of doing the work nationally, of pursuing the work on the congressional level, let's not forget our cities as a site of resistance as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Ramah.
Thank you so much, Katie.